In this picture, we are in the cave at the beginning because of the fallen, physical, embodied state of humanity. To begin the ascent out may take one's own effort of will properly directed by God's word, or may represent an arbitrary act of God's good grace. Either way, the rough, steep slope to the world of sunlight becomes equated with salvation, and especially with a triumph over the body, conceived of as the locus of sensory pleasure, pain, desire, fear and suffering, sin and temptation. The final illumination, which for Plato is the triumph of understanding, reason and intelligence, is subtly reconfigured as the triumph of the purely spiritual element of the soul, either temporarily, as in moments of mystical illumination, or permanently, as in salvation after bodily death. From Plotinus through to adepts such as the early 20th century French philosopher Henri Bergson, the religious Plato has consorted with the idea of mystical awareness of transcendence, an awareness, however, that is often achieved by a dark journey into the centre of the soul. By confronting the self and what it is, the adept gains freedom from its demands. The idea suggests a purely personal struggle, not a passive reception of doctrine, such as might be transmitted by a church or a book. In turn, this explains why dead Aristotelian logic was more associated with the Catholic Church, while Plato remains the champion of inner light Protestantism, whereby each pilgrim is responsible for his or her own salvation. This idea, in turn, has affinities with another doctrine of Plato's, albeit one more associated with another dialogue, Meno. Here Plato suggests that our innate knowledge is in fact a recollection of knowledge, not belief, gained in a previous state of existence before birth. Christianity could not absorb that as it stands, since it denies the pre-existence of souls. But the doctrine could be tamed, as it were, into the belief that there is an inner candle of the Lord, a source of light within each of us as private Platonic sun, visible after a path of redemption and purification. Recollection was much used, but similarly tamed, later on in England in the 18th century, by the poets Coleridge, Shelley and Wordsworth. Each was enchanted by the idea of the eclipsing curse of birth, which permeated Wordsworth's many celebrations of childhood, and especially his Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, although probably each regarded it more as a charming idea than as a doctrine. It was sufficiently vague but uplifting to incorporate both a sentimental conception of childish innocence and the apparently conflicting view that innocence is not, as it might seem, mere ignorance, but itself a kind of superior knowledge. A recollection of transcendence such as the Platonic philosopher might possess, or the soul might look forward to re-establishing in eternity. Such an idea may be food for the poet, but it is not exactly a belief to which one could really assent. The transcendental interpretation may have inspired religious minds, but it also draws the venom of philosophers who are not estranged from the world and who despise those who are. The elevated mysticism of Plotinus is only to some tastes, and in any case it easily degenerates into mere transcendental twaddle, or the mumbo-jumbo and charlatanry of hermeticists, theosophists, and other cultists. So as far as Plato goes, however, the central problems are first that there is not a very close resemblance between the kind of education necessary for the Platonic elite and the mystical illumination celebrated by the ascetic sage or saint who has turned his back on the world and the intellect alike. Whatever else the Platonic education demands, it clearly requires a deep immersion in mathematics and in dialectic or reason, and partly for military purposes. It is essentially an intellectual journey, although built on the foundation of a childhood steeped in harmony and proportion. Second, there is the even more pressing problem of why anyone takes the reverse journey. Plato is clear that the philosopher, having exited from the cave, must return and apply his revelation to the business of governing the state. The question is, why should he do so? And still more, what has he discovered that qualifies him to do so? Plato is aware of this as a problem, of course. At 500b, he insists on it. The point is, of course, Adeimantus, that someone whose mind really is fixed on reality has no time to cast his gaze downwards onto the affairs of men and to enter into their disputes, and so be infected with resentment and malice. So long as the emphasis is on transcending the worldly, this problem can have no answer. Perhaps it is fascinating enough, and even revelatory of something, to contemplate the eternal and unchanging. But we still have no model for applying that unchanging and unvarying reality to the world of military tactics, politics, and business, the world of resentment and malice. Why, then, return to the cave? And what, in any case, do you bring with you? The Christian hermit contemplating his skull may have a sage and philosophical attitude to mortal life and its problems, but he is scarcely a model for the well-ordered ruler of the state, even if we manage to tolerate or admire him on his own terms. Chapter 12. The Poetic Interpretation. Can you find any flaw, then, in an occupation like this, which, in order to be competently practised, requires the following inherent qualities in a person: a good memory, quickness at learning, broadness of vision, elegance, and love of and affiliation to truth, morality, courage, and self-discipline? Hence there is space for the second interpretation that captured the European imagination and which went in a very different direction. This also took seriously material from other dialogues, this time Phaedrus and Symposium. It brings to the foreground something surprisingly absent in the central books of Republic, which is the importance of beauty and the related importance of love, or eros, in Plato's metaphor of ascent. In Symposium, Socrates, on the face of it a much more attractive Socrates than his namesake in Republic, relates how he learned a story of ascent from a wise old priestess, Diotima. Her ascent of the soul begins from the experience of beauty, in the person of someone who is loved. It progresses, of course, from love of corporeal to spiritual beauty, or from beauty embodied in one person to that which is visible in many. But, and here is the difference from the religious interpretation, the initial beauty of the individual is never wholly left behind. Such beauty is itself divine bounty. It is always to be seen. It is not the beginning of an ascent to anything unseen, although it may be the beginning of an ascent to a different, better appreciation of what is seen. There is no lament here for what Coleridge, enamoured of the transcendental interpretation, denigrated as the despotism of the eye. This is the Plato that is most attractive to artists and creators. The idea is that to look on things with real love is already to discern immortal qualities in them, qualities of beauty, grace, truth, or harmony, that can in principle be manifested anywhere in space or time, and are in that sense timeless. The paradigm Platonic experience is not now otherworldly, but this-worldly, only this world appreciated as it should be, when the banquet of the senses is enlarged with imagination and insight. Frequently the insight is supposed to have a moral dimension. In the works of the writer Iris Murdoch, for example, the connection with ethics is made because the experience of love takes the agent outside him or herself, making possible an appreciation of the beloved that is itself an unselfing, representing a displacement of the selfish ego from its usual throne in the centre of things. This view has much to commend it. It makes excellent sense of the evident connection in Plato's mind between beauty, goodness, and truth. For us, perhaps, these three have little to do with each other. Beauty, if we talk about it at all, is relegated to the peripheral, and persons who harp on it are regarded with suspicion, airy-fairy aesthetes, weightless and unserious. Goodness is a matter of ethics, and while we ourselves may have principles which raise us above the Athenian envoys, we become nervous if it intrudes too far into people's minds. Do-gooder is a derogatory term. Meanwhile, our paradigm of truth is probably scientific truth, which has nothing much to do with either beauty or goodness. As in the Humean model of motivation and action outlined above, we tend to think that knowledge is one thing, and how you choose to use it, for good or ill, to create beauty or destroy it, is another thing altogether. Indeed, Plato also recognizes that the lower forms of belief and perhaps knowledge are at the disposal of twisted ends just as much as higher ends. The connection between knowledge or understanding and goodness is only forged, if it ever is, at the highest level. Part of the charm of Plato is the sense of being in a world in which these fractures did not exist. Ours may be a world in which there is a division between fact on the one hand and value on the other. But his world is, in the phrase of the godfather of modern sociology, Max Weber, an enchanted world, in which ideas like proportion and harmony efface any such division. Beauty makes both goodness and truth manifest, so its perception and the love it engenders together give us the first step out of the cave. Beauty is the first erasure of the distinction between fact and value. It is borne in upon us, in erotic experience, like facts, but it is intrinsically or essentially connected with the values of pleasure and love. And just as it erases the fact-value distinction, so beauty erases the tyranny of the self. In loving something or someone for beauty's sake, we are, as Iris Murdoch says, unselfed. Selfish desire has no place in the pure aesthetic experience. The poetic Plato is the prophet of courtly love, of pure spiritual unity with the beloved, contrasted with the sweaty appetites of the unwashed. He is the Plato of the first part of John Donne's Ecstasy. Our hands were firmly cemented with a fast balm, which thence did spring our eye-beams twisted, and did thread our eyes upon one double string. As twixt two equal armies, fate suspends uncertain victory. Our souls, which to advance their state were gone out, hung twixt her and me. And whilst our souls negotiate there, we like sepulchral statues lay. All day the same our postures were, and we said nothing all the day. Notice that an afternoon gazing into the beloved's eyes is not a substitution of the otherworldly for the specific here and now. On the contrary, it is an intense, almost microscopic appreciation of the here and now, one illuminated by the sun, as it were, rather than in the gloom. Donne himself is, however, an imperfect Platonist of this stamp, since while all this commingling of souls is fine enough, it becomes, dare one suppose, a little tedious, and Donne is content that the body should eventually have its say as well. But oh, alas, so long, so far, our bodies, why do we forbear? They are ours, though they are not we are the intelligences, they the sphere. So must pure lovers' souls descend to affections and to faculties, which sense may reach and apprehend, else a great prince in prison lies. Although this lapse may, after all, be a true rendering of Plato himself, to whom return to the cave and to the world of the senses and their illusions is not entirely a fall, but a natural progress. The distinction between the religious Plato and the poetic one is extremely apt to blur. In one respect, the poetic Plato is actually nearer to one strand in Christianity. The poetic Plato's beauty can be incarnated, that is its whole point, and similarly, according to Christianity, the good itself can be incarnated, and once was. Each philosophy needs to effect a bridge between something which is too rarefied, too abstract, too pure to engage with human life, and something else which can find a seat in day-to-day living. For the poetic Platonist, the soul is revivified by a renewed erotic perception of beauty. For the Christian, by a renewed acquaintance with the personification of goodness in the incarnation of Christ. For Christianity, this is, however, just one element in a fundamentally otherworldly philosophy. Christ is himself just a signpost to the real consummation of eternal life in the other world. For the poetic Platonist, the incarnation is everything. The problem of the return to the cave is not so severe for poetic Platonism as for religious Platonism, but it does not disappear entirely either. It is not so much the rediscovery of the body that is a problem, as a rediscovery of pursuits and problems that have nothing much to do with beauty or love, problems of politics and morals, for instance. With respect to Iris Murdoch, we may yet doubt if the Melians would have been impressed if the Athenian envoys had come ashore while raptly admiring the line of beauty incarnated in a rose-leaf, or the beauty of their toy boys' profiles. The suggestion must be that so much immersion in beauty would free the Athenians from the ambition, fear, or greed that prompted their brutal politics. But amongst human beings, this is not how it works. The aesthetic only forms a temporary respite from the moral and political. The Athenian envoys, however susceptible to beauty they might have been, would soon enough have cast aside their rose-leaves and toy boys and got to work, blackmailing the Melians, just as they in fact did. The lives of the artists are seldom all that edifying, And that in turn reminds us that while the themes of love and beauty are prominent, as we have said, in other dialogues, in Republic itself they are overshadowed by the eventual banishment of the artists, to which we shortly return. As the quotation at the head of this section shows, Plato seems to be pursuing themes other than contemplative immersion in beauty. An enjoyable afternoon lying on the riverbank with a lover, or raptly engaging with the exhibits in a gallery, can scarcely be said to require each or any of a good memory, quickness at learning, broadness of vision, elegance, and love of and affiliation to truth, morality, courage, and self-discipline, which his philosopher king must exhibit. So in spite of the enchantments of the poetic life, we still lack a satisfactory model for the ascent from the cave. Chapter 13. The Scientific Interpretation. "It's nothing special," I said. "It's the ability to distinguish 1, 2, and 3. In short, I'm talking about number and counting. I mean, isn't it the case that every branch of expertise and knowledge is bound to have some involvement with numbers and with counting?" The third interpretation of the myth of the cave takes seriously Plato's talk of order and proportion, as well as the timelessness of the reality with which the elite is acquainted. The suggestion is that the transcendental world is fundamentally that of mathematics, or at most the world of mathematical objects suitably extended to include inevitably the good and the beautiful. It is almost impossible to overemphasize the place that mathematics, particularly the theory of harmony and the theory of geometry, occupied in Plato's conception of wisdom or insight into the scheme of the cosmos. Plato is supposed to have visited southern Italy and learned what he could from the Pythagoreans installed at their base there in Metapontum, on the Gulf of Taranto. To these the whole universe ran according to a mathematical scheme, just as the sequence of musical notes obeyed the mathematical laws of harmony. Plato's description of the education of the elite flows from mathematics. The mathematical model makes a good deal of sense. The subject matter of arithmetic and geometry is timeless. Furthermore, the understanding we attain by using them is often timeless as well, the laws governing musical harmony, for instance. Better than that, we find here for the first time a kind of defence of the view which I pilloried in Chapter 9, that the domains of knowledge and belief are different, and that the first concerns what is permanent and unvarying, while the second does not. Suppose we think not in terms of knowledge, but of understanding. Then there is something right about the claim that however often we are faced with change, we only come to understand it by bringing to bear something unchanging, a constant that can be seen throughout the process, or that can be brought up alongside it like a ruler, in order to make it intelligible. And perhaps this is the vital nerve of Plato's system. Thus faced with a changing system, science itself requires the application of laws, themselves unchanging, governing the changes of the magnitudes defining the system and its state at one time and another. These laws and an initial set of magnitudes govern the state of the system at a later time. What is fixed may be mass, or temperature, or energy, or combinations of these, or complex functions of them, or even more ethereal quantities such as probabilities. But something there must be to feed the equations that describe the evolution of state, the nature of changes in systems, whether they are mechanical, chemical, gravitational, thermodynamic, or quantum mechanical, and thence make scientific understanding of change possible. Where one constant after another flickers out, for example as we consider times nearer and nearer to the singularity which we dub the Big Bang, we get closer and closer to the point at which our understanding gives out as well. On this account, it is the scientist and mathematician who sees eternity in a wild flower, or in the starry night sky, or the intricacies of the atom, by finding the changeless laws or forms of growth underlying temporal becoming. It would of course be entirely unhistorical to credit the Pythagoreans or Plato himself with an understanding of the shape that scientific explanation would eventually take. Even late into the 17th century, when scientists such as Newton were finally coming up with equations governing simple mechanical and gravitational interactions, the prevailing view was that this was all very well, but it did not really amount to science, the holy grail of rational, mathematical insight into not just the way things are, but the way they have to be. It was only in the 18th century that philosophers reconciled themselves to the empiricist dispensation that the kind of thing Newton did was all we were ever going to get. It would be absurd to see Plato as anticipating those centuries. But all that we really require for this kind of interpretation of the enlightenment of the philosopher is that Plato and Pythagoras knew they were onto something, so that the triumph represented by a mathematical modelling of musical harmony was a paradigm to follow. Hence the massive concentration upon mathematics in the education of the elite in the ideal republic. The mathematical scientific model has another advantage. Modern epistemologists fall over themselves denouncing the spectator theory of knowledge, or the view that they find in Plato, which thinks of moments of especially intense vision, illuminations, as the best exemplars of knowledge. But in Plato, and still more obviously in Aristotle, the relevant spectator is not what Plato would have called a mere sightseer, but rather what we would call the theorist, the person who can deploy an understanding of what he sees, and thereby literally sees something different from the untutored eye, however intense the latter may be. In fact, the Greek word theoria originally meant a spectator or spectacle in the rather refined context of the expert or official observer of a sacred event, someone who understands what is going on. Compare the expert spectator of a cricket match or the expert listener to a jazz quartet beside the casual sightseer or listener. It may well be that Plato himself conceived the application of mathematics to nature in a more exotic way than any gained by measuring magnitude of different properties of systems and establishing by observation and conjecture, trial and error, how they change through time.